Hello everyone, Sakuya here, and welcome back to another alternate history What If Hearts of Iron 4 video. Thank you my friends to all of you who have been watching and supporting me in this series. I know that you all like it, and I thank you very much for joining with me on this journey. Today's question was of course chosen by our community, who voted to ask, what if Japan did not attack the USA and instead attack the Soviets? Well, let's go ahead and see about that. I will say before we begin that if anyone out there watching this wants their own scenario to be a future video, then make sure to put that question in the comment section below. I take the top 5 most liked comments and I put those suggestions that they give in community posts in order to determine what is the next video that we make. But okay then, January 1st, 1936, and the man of many chins comes to battle. I have to say that among all the varying different suggestions that we could possibly be given, this is one of the most fascinating ones, and it's something that people have asked many times throughout history, because not all of the things that happened in World War II were guaranteed to happen. And Japan is easily the finest example of that. At the time that our story is going to begin, on January 1st, 1936, Japan really is at a crossroads. At the time that this is taking place, Japan is in the midst of a inter-service rivalry, where factions between the Navy and the Army are competing over prestige, over political influence, over resources, over pretty much everything. And it is here in 1936 that events would take place that would determine the course of Japan's future. What do I mean? Well, we're going to need to explain some context. Also on that note, in some of my previous videos, I had seen comments that said things like, oh wow, halfway through the video and it's just 1937. Man, this is so stupidly slow, and stuff like that. My friends, this is an alternate history video that utilized gaming as a medium in order to be able to explain things. While I do love alternate history and playing around with these ideas, one of the most frustrating parts about this particular genre is that the majority of people who talk about alternate history scenarios do almost nothing in regards to setup to explain how something became the way that it did. Literally anyone out there could ask, oh, what if Germany won World War II, and then not actually explain how it is that that would be possible to take place in the first place. Context is extremely important, as that determines everything. In the case of Japan, starting in 1936, at the very beginning, this is when a crucial event was going to take place. As you can see on its political focus tree, it has purged the Kodaha faction or support the Kodaha faction. At this time, there are 2 ideologies that exist that are trying to take over the government in Japan. You have one that is the more nationalist, northern, aggressive Kodaha faction, something that wants to prioritize the army, and the other is the more conservative Toseha faction, which wants to focus more on defense against the Soviet Union and expand southwards. That you can see represented down here by the Strike South Doctrine, the thing that in our timeline would end up with Japan going after the Philippines and Indonesia, all in an effort to try and secure resources from the south, and from there be able to supply its army, as Japan has a severe deficit of both oil and also steel. Even now, from the very beginning of the game, it is showing that we are trading for 16 oil from the United States, something that in our timeline, in our historical timeline, the United States would eventually cut off and embargo Japan, which would lead to a severe shortage. This is one of the key reasons as to why Japan wanted to move southwards in order to be able to take over the Dutch East Indies and the very rich oil and rubber provinces that are down here. The reason as to why Japan went more with the strike south instead of the strike north idea, which was to take out essentially the Soviet Union and take over this large swath of Siberia, which is extremely rich in natural resources, though in this case it's more representing steel among other things. Yes, here we go. Steel, tungsten, like all these very valuable goods. This is what Japan wants to control, all right here. The reason that they did not go through with that plan is because the Kodaha faction that supported this, that wanted this to happen, ended up getting purged. And here's the context. Over the course of the early 1930s, heading into the late 1930s, a series of border wars would take place between Japan, Manchukuo, and the Soviet Union. Essentially, over the course of like half a decade, there was an unofficial war that was going on here in the East, which is represented over here by operations in which you can test the Soviets. Literally thousands of people would end up dying in these battles that were never actually a part of any kind of real official war. The entire time, Japan was trying to test the Soviets in order to determine whether or not they would be able to take more territories that were richer in resources and slowly expand their influence. The ultimate result of this, though, was failure. At the Battle of Kakengol in 1939, Japan would be utterly humiliated by the Soviet Union, which in turn would lead to the complete destruction of the idea of moving north. Therefore, if we're building an alternate history scenario in which Japan is going to actually go with that northern plan, then a couple things need to happen. First off, we are going to need to make a choice regarding the Kodaha faction. Technically speaking, right now, there is nothing that restricts us from purging the Kodaha faction, of having their coup fail, and move towards the Soviets later by saying, hey, those testing little battles, those probing attacks, those things actually worked out for the Japanese, and because they were successful instead of a failure, this means that the Japanese are actually going to move against the Soviets instead. The second is going down hardline support and actually pushing forward the Kodaha faction, which will result in a direct war with the Soviet Union after a series of tests. In my opinion, the most likely scenario to take place in here, even if it sounds a little bit far-fetched for the coup to actually succeed, is for the Kodaha faction to actually have their incident, which was the February 26th incident, or 29th, which one was it? Yeah, it wasn't a leap year. The February 26th incident, that's the name of it here. The attempted coup by young Japanese officers to assassinate the Prime Minister of Japan, and also to eliminate all their political and military opponents within the higher echelons of the Japanese government, that this is actually going to succeed. Because purging the Kodaha faction still pushes us down the path of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, among other things, to try and secure China, it makes more sense that, considering the number of generals that during this time have been trying to push forward towards the Soviets, we're going to say that in the years leading up to 1936, up to this point, that the border wars here were more successful for the Japanese than they were in our timeline, which gives more power to the Kodaha faction. Thus, their coup attempt actually succeeds. A new faction has appeared, intent to take control of the government and strike north into the Soviet Union. For the sake of the Emperor and the Empire's future, we must ensure that this faction prevails. Military factor-wise, what we're going to end up doing is prioritizing the army. We're going to say that the Kodaha faction and others are increasing their strength, and so prioritization in this case is going to be given entirely towards the Japanese Imperial Army rather than the Navy. With no plans to strike further south, there really is no reason to dedicate the time, energy, and resources towards this. But also, the way that we have to play this thing out is that we have to be not smart, we have to be realistic. As an example, one of the things that would normally happen if you're going up against the Soviet Union is that we would build a ton of tanks, because tanks are really great at taking out the Soviets, particularly in the more flat areas of the Soviet Union. However, even though Japan was one of the first nations to utilize actual tank units on the battlefield, their tanks sucked, like a lot. And so even if we say that with more prioritization being given to the army, this meant that more of the steel and resources are actually going to be dedicated towards these, their technology is still never going to be the best, and they are not going to be as good as Soviet tanks, or used in nearly the same amount of numbers. We're talking a couple hundred versus the Soviet couple thousand. And by couple, I mean the Soviet Union at one point had like a fleet of 5,000 tanks, I think, in the beginning, in like the early 1930s. It's a lot. As such, with the rise of the Kodaha faction, we have the Young Officer Coup. A group of young officers have succeeded in assassinating various government officials, as well as the Prime Minister. They've occupied Tokyo City and have secured control of the Imperial Palace, announcing their intent to purge the government of corrupt officials and ideological threats, reinstating the Emperor as the sole ruler of the nation. Their actions had an unexpectedly large following in the military, where intended counter-operations were forestalled by mass arrests and assassinations of elements loyal to the old government. Faced with the sudden and overwhelming nature of events, as well as rebel control of the palace, the Emperor has made no move to denounce the rebels. Organized government resistance seems already to crumble, and the rebels are expected at any time to announce the establishment of total imperial control to all areas of domestic, foreign, and military policy. Yes, with this we have the rise of the Kodaha faction, and it brings us to a very interesting point. You have two options of either adopting the modern shogunate, in which the emperor is more of a figurehead and the military still has larger amounts of control, or you have the Showa restoration, in which the emperor himself takes direct control of things. In my opinion, the Showa restoration is the better option, but realistically, this is not likely to happen. The Imperial Palace was not happy about the coup attempt in our timeline. They were very unhappy with this, and they showed no leniency. The idea of putting the emperor in charge, a guy who actually did not really want war, is something that is counterintuitive to this alternate history scenario. As such, it makes more sense that after a coup, that a shogunate would take place. where the emperor is technically in charge and above everything else, but it's actually this new radical faction that is the one that is leading things, even though the effects of this are arguably worse, with the only bonus being a little bit more war support and military factory construction, but even less research speed when we already have a -5 as it is. The next step after securing the government would naturally be to secure the economy, and the zaibatsus, the major corporations that control large swaths of the Japanese economy at this time, they would be challenged and put under control. At the same time this happens, with the inter-service rivalry, considering the success of the Koda faction, this means that any kind of steel that is being made is going to be prioritized for guns. They're going to prioritize army aircraft construction. They're going to institute more conscription. Essentially, significantly more focus is going to be given to the army. After this, new laws will be put into place that specifically prioritize the development more of the Imperial Japanese Army, and research will be put towards trying to develop new weapons and tactics in order to be able to be used to fight against the Soviets. And naturally, with this new technology, all efforts are to be made to try and equip the army as best as possible. What we would say regarding that is that we know historically that the Japanese did not have very good tanks. To say that they suddenly produced amazing ones in order to be able to fight the Soviets is ridiculous. That's not going to happen. While we will say that with more research and with more priority being given to the army, that more developments of tanks are likely to happen in comparison of prioritizing that steel for ships, more focus instead is likely to be given to the Air Force, which historically Japan did actually have a fairly solid Air Force in the beginning, though it was much smaller in comparison to the Soviets. And also, they had very good artillery pieces as well as anti-tank pieces. So thus, it makes more sense that with a significantly more infantry focus, we're going to be utilizing a lot of anti-tank. Of course, with all of this steel and military developments that are happening, this naturally means that steel is going to have to be bought. Thus, we are going to be buying from the United States, as historically did happen, and because we're not going to be going after China or anything like that, or trying to expand into the South, theoretically, this means that the United States might not embargo us in this timeline. But either way, it's at this point heading into 1937 that Japan would begin to prepare for war with the Soviet Union. Military factories would be developed, they would develop their infrastructure, efforts would be specifically made in order to enable an invasion of Siberia, though that would take some time. Another development that is naturally going to occur is Germany still continuing with the Anti-Comintern Pact, and this is something that, considering what Japan is planning, they would naturally join, as any kind of defense against the Soviets would be welcomed. As part of these war preparations against the Soviet Union, multiple things would be happening. With less emphasis on a strike south doctrine, this means that although aggression has been showed towards China in the past, now it seems more prudent to specifically try to secure the border and make sure that nothing happens. Simultaneously, more efforts are going to have to be made in order to secure and stabilize Manchukuo, both building up its industry, increasing Japanese settlers in the area, and also preparing for any kind of infrastructure that are needed for an invasion of Siberia. Once this is done, considering the ideological animosity that exists between Germany and the Soviet Union, it still makes sense that the Japanese would pursue some kind of agreement with the Germans by which they would be able to communicate and develop themselves further. In this case, it's represented by a technological exchange. There's also a thing in here from this that says, Gets event, the Japanese shogunate seeks to join the Axis, in which Japan does fully join the Axis instead of just being part of the tripartite pact. That doesn't really make sense here. Japan is not going to suddenly and aggressively try to get Germany to attack from the other side. This is still something where they would try to do things on their own, so I don't think that this is realistic to just expect that Germany is going to help them attack the Soviets. So that means instead of doing this and immediately launching a war against the Soviets, what we would do is begin to prepare Manchuria as well as the army. Considering the difficulties that China faces with its warlords, the chances of them going against Japan and not trying to secure a non-aggression pact, this is extremely unlikely. They are going to want to focus on things internally. With developments in Manchuria, the next natural step is going to be preparation for the army. The army is set to be expanded, more recruitment is set to happen, simultaneously further developments will occur for weaponry. The question is, at this point, does Japan focus on technology or does it focus on will? And the answer is that historically, Japan would focus on will. They didn't focus nearly as much on the development of their weapons. The human body was the most useful tool, which is why even going into later in World War II, they were utilizing infantry wave tactics, which would result in mass casualties, both against the United States and even prior to this when they were doing so in border tests against the Soviets. To that end, one may actually wonder, okay, are we going to improve ourselves by going with superior firepower? And the answer is no. No, if we're playing this out realistically, then Japan is still going to go down the Grand Battle Plan doctrine. And if we were going to organize our officer corps, then Even though logistical focus would be significantly better for fighting in Siberia, this is Japan, which means victory or death. Yeah. Combine that with bold attack and also an accomplished heritage, and you have a recipe for what is the Japanese military. Is it the most optimal combination? No, but it's the most realistic. So it is then that heading into late 1937, the real developments that I see beginning are a focus on aircraft as well as anti-tank capabilities. The Japanese, after all, do not have as much ability when it comes to tanks, so it makes more sense that instead of prioritizing like the Zero when it comes to the Navy, that this is instead going to be utilized in preparation to provide air support for their war against the Soviets. As 1938 would roll around, the military of Japan would steadily be growing, the railways within Manchuria would also simultaneously be growing, and also on that note, infrastructure would be prepared specifically for launching an operation. It brings us this question at this point of when would a war actually break out? Border skirmishes were occurring the entire time over the course of 1930, or even going back into the 20s, all the way into 1939 when the Battle of Khalkhin would happen. As such, even though we could preemptively launch a strike and attack the Soviet Union prior to this, it would only really make sense that if the Battle of Khalkhin had gone differently, if more focus had been put on whittling down the Soviet Union over the course of these years and expanding Japanese influence, that if they had won this battle, then they would be able to go further into the Soviet Union. As such, we're not going to be launching any strikes. We're not going to be doing anything like that. We're going to wait and see how this plays out. Of course, the problem is that even with a non-aggression pact, one of the things that is likely to still happen is that there will still be Chinese provocations, except in this case, actual Chinese provocations, not just the ones that were faked by virtue of the fact that Japan wanted to be able to invade China per our actual historical timeline. Communist guerrillas were quite literally everywhere in this time, and also there were varying different Chinese nationalist parties that specifically wanted to inflict damage upon the Japanese. So while these incidents did not happen nearly as much in our actual timeline, they would happen here in this case as Japan would be trying to leave China alone mostly. As a result of this, most certainly Japan would go to war, except in this case, they're not actually going to be limited by the emperor. One of the things that Emperor Hirohito had tried to do is not actually have a fight with China. So the fake provocations that Japan created in order to be able to attack China were never sanctioned by the government. It was an illegal war for large parts until it was later expanded upon. In this case, though, with actual provocations, the call to go to war would be very real, and as such, mobilization would happen. Japan would fight China. Considering all the military preparations that had been taking place in order to prepare for war against the Soviet Union, this means that Japan going into the Chinese war is actually going to be significantly more prepared than they were in our timeline. China, yes, does have an additional year to possibly prepare, but considering that they have had a non-aggression pact with Japan this entire time, it means that they're not going to have nearly as many defenses as they otherwise would in preparation for a Japanese offensive. With significantly more preparations, there is much less supply issues going into this conflict. The Chinese, on the other hand, though they would have had an additional year in order to actually be able to prepare, simultaneously would have been spending this entire time fighting with the other factions, the other warlords, in order to be able to try and cement their authority. Thus, the state here is still extremely weak. And with no war with Japan in order to secure their legitimacy, this war would come as quite a shock. Very quickly, within a matter of weeks, the entirety of northern China would fall. With no Chinese united front, this means that Shanxi, this means that Jibei-Sanma, communist China is not helping, nothing is happening. Instead, the national government of China stands alone as the rest of the warlords try to maintain their own sovereignty. I also realized that I actually, from this, called Germany into the conflict, considering that I'm still part of the Axis in this timeline. That shouldn't have actually happened here, but it is what it is. Of course, with an actual war in China going on, the Americans are still going to be trading with the Chinese, and so the United States is going to demand an apology after the Panay incident, though later in our timeline is still likely to occur here. We will do whatever it is that we can in order to try to placate the Americans in this case, because China is not the priority here. Moving into winter of 1938, no less than 2 months after the conflict would begin, the Japanese, with superior firepower, with superior planning, and at this point significantly more preparation, would have actually been able to take out the Chinese much more easily. It is during this time of Chinese provocations that a national defense state would take place. Total mobilization of all of Japanese society would launch, as with China being supported by the Soviet Union, which did happen in our timeline, this means that the Japanese would naturally see the Soviet Union as their primary enemy. And so it is then that without the support of the rest of the Chinese warlords, that here it is that Japan actually manages to take out China, or at least large swaths of it. What would more than likely occur in this timeline, if they were behaving a little bit more diplomatically, we could say, is that a puppet government would be established and that only parts of China would be occupied, while the rest of it would be reorganized under a puppet state, similar to what happened with Manchukuo. In this case, for the temporary time, China will be occupied by Japan, after which the only remaining threat in this case would be the communists, who are in turn subsequently wiped out. And so it is then that after several brutal weeks of fighting, eventually too, communist China would collapse, with no additional support that is able to come in from the Soviet Union having been completely cut off, and Shanxi, Zibei-sama, and Xiankang no longer working with any kind of Chinese United Front. There really is not much of a hope for them. Peace is thus brought to Asia. Though I say peace, the actions that would take place during this time would be horribly oppressive and entirely brutal and genocidal. The problem that would take place at this time, though, is that considering the resources that would be used specifically to occupy China during this time, it subsequently means that there isn't going to be resources in order to be able to launch a strike against the Soviets. The Northern Plan would have to be further delayed. So it is that in August of 1939, World War II would officially still break out. Poland would refuse the German ultimatum, war would still take place, but weirdly enough, Asia is much more at peace. It's at this point that the Soviet Union would still go down its normal path of declaring war upon Finland. This is an action that brings up a very interesting question. Considering the border tests that have been happening at this time, it would make sense that at the point where the Soviet Union is distracted with Finland, it is here, after months of peace and urging by the Japanese to get revenge upon the Soviets for their aid for the Chinese, that the Japanese would in turn begin to test the border with the Soviets. As you can see, they've already withdrawn the overwhelming majority of their troops from the front line, and so it is then that in this scenario, more than likely, this fateful border conflict would finally begin. We share a long border with the Soviet Union and Korea Manchuria. A large number of potential flashpoints exist where our forces might clash at any moment. For us, this creates an opportunity to test the Soviet response to a minor provocation. With the Soviets so heavily distracted in the West, this means that a Japanese victory is actually likely. Following a clash between Soviet and Japanese forces in the border area around Lake Khasan, the Soviet forces are reportedly in full retreat. Japanese units have occupied a number of strategic hills around the area and begun to fortify the position. During the battle, the Japanese captured a number of Soviet tanks, which have been shipped to Tokyo for evaluation. A kind of loss like this in Eastern Asia would severely worry the Soviet Union. As such, they would wish to maintain peace with the Germans for as long as possible, seeing the Japanese now as a potential much bigger threat. As such, it would make sense if around the region, Soviet border guards would be doubled or even tripled, with extensive resources being poured into Mongolia and other states to potentially be able to deal with the Japanese. Of course, by this time, the Soviet Union and Germany already have a non-aggression pact. It is very unlikely that Japan at this point would expect any help from Germany. Still, by winning the border conflict in the East, this would in turn give the Japanese politicians and generals significantly more confidence in their abilities, perhaps too much in this sense. Thus it is that prior to any German plans to invade the Soviet Union, the Japanese would do so themselves, preparing to launch a preemptive war. With claims fabricated upon the Soviets, it is here that Japan would go ahead and launch its strike. Here's where things get a little bit iffy, and this is going to sound weird for many of you that are watching this right now. In the opening weeks of the conflict, the Japanese would make astounding gains, as the Soviets simply would not be prepared. Most of their attention would be focused on the West, but simultaneously, after their loss in the East, there would still be increased defenses. These things are quickly overrun, as the Red Army would in turn retreat further up into Siberia. The problem is that eventually this would stop. The Soviet army, just like in our time, was constantly retreating from the Germans. And while the Japanese would have a significant advantage in the beginning, as they would be able to surprise and take out many of the Soviet positions who are not properly reinforced, simultaneously they are going to pay for every square inch. But the Soviets would have overwhelming numbers. More importantly, they would have superiority in both air force and simultaneously in armor. Hundreds of kilometers could potentially be taken, but eventually the tide of battle would turn against the Japanese, who in turn would be forced to stop their offensive. As winter would gradually set in, the Japanese would be forced onto the defensive, with the Soviets taking the opportunity to build up significantly more of their positions in the east. More infrastructure, more air force, more everything. What many people who are watching may fail to understand is that considering the sheer size of the Soviet tank fleet, as well as the overwhelming number of aircraft, both in terms of quality and quantity, though the initial opening months of the conflict would be in the Japanese's favor, things would turn against them. The only real bonus that they possibly have during this time is that there is very unlikely to be a shortage in oil and resources, considering that the Japanese are fighting the Soviet Union, communists who basically no one really likes. They're more than likely not going to get cut off from trade by the United States, which means that they can actually afford to purchase oil. Very quickly, the front line would turn into a war of attrition of who can outlast the other on it. What ends up happening moving into 1942 is that we would likely see a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, it is more than likely that Moscow would eventually fall, as the majority of Soviet forces have been pushed to the east, or at least were initially, allowing the Germans to rapidly move into the country. The downside is that by the Soviets having so many of their forces in the east, they are actually on par with the Japanese, or in fact superior, meaning that eventually the Japanese are going to get pushed back, and all of those men do not get surrounded and killed in the east. Thus, though the Soviets would likely lose Moscow, they would manage to begin to push back the Japanese. Eventually, considering the terrain, the anti-air, the anti-tank, all of the big weapons that the Japanese would have been trying to bring up in order to fight against the Soviets would gradually get, well, destroyed. They would wear out. They would get surrounded and killed off by tank units. When the Soviets in turn called up literally millions of reservists, this is something that, well, guaranteed that the fight was going to drag out for significantly longer. But by the logic that we have presented here, the Soviets are not going to lose nearly as many of their men in the beginning, meaning that once they actually pull out their forces to be able to fight, though it would be a truly terrible slog, eventually they would be able to combat the Germans on their own terms. There is also the added fact that one needs to consider that in the event that the Soviet Union ends up going to war with the Japanese first, even with more damage being done to their individual men, this means that reforms are more than likely to take place faster than they did in our timeline. Thus, the Soviets would actually have some of their purges already completed and military men capable of receiving the German attack. By this point, heading into mid-1943, maybe into early 1944, this is where things really begin to turn against the Germans as well as the Japanese. The Allied invasion of Italy would have already taken place, which in turn means that after fracturing into civil war, the Germans now have to redirect forces from their already faltering front line down to the south in order to be able to preserve that. Eventually it is, heading into 1944, that the tide really begins to turn against the Germans. They're simply overstretched everywhere. So it is then, by mid-1944, that things would have drastically changed. Moscow would have fallen back into Soviet hands. The Germans, who were overstretched on every single front, would now find their west falling to the Allies, who would have already launched D-Day. And with such a rapid approach, the thing that is more likely in this scenario is that in fact the Allies are the ones who end up reaching into Germany first. In our timeline, of course, the Germans had been stopped significantly earlier, but by virtue of the Soviet forces being more spread out, it means that the Soviets had much more ground that they had to regain to take back their old capital. As for the Japanese, much of the gains into Siberia would have been lost. Eventually, it is likely that the front would have stabilized, perhaps surrounding just beyond Manchukuo from the initial conquests, but beyond that, there simply would have been no hope for the Japanese to be able to push further in. By this point, the Soviet war machine would be in full gear, and the German Reich would be slowly crumbling. Eventually, by late 1944, perhaps going into 1945, Berlin would fall, and in this case, to the Allies. While the Soviets have made much of their territory back, it is not enough to be able to race the Allies to conquer Germany. Too many forces would have been split off in order to be able to try and protect the East, which in turn has become a stalemate. So it is then that by 1945, in this case early 1945, World War II, as it stands, would be over. Technically speaking, the Soviets would still be fighting with the Japanese, but the war in the West is done. The interesting question that a number of people may have is, well, okay, in the scenario, why is it that the war is over faster? It doesn't seem likely if the Japanese were attacking the Soviet Union that they would have been able to spare the forces, that they would have been able to fight against the Germans. Well, here's the thing. The Japanese actions to take out French Indochina, to take out the Philippines, to take out the Dutch East Indies, this killed off a crucial amount of resources, rubber, oil, etc., that specifically would have been shipped from Asia in order to be able to supply forces in Western Europe. The loss of this territory to the Japanese was something that crippled the war effort. In the Japanese turning around to strike north and instead buying products off of the United States and others, this in turn means that Britain does not run into nearly as many supply issues. They are able to sustain more of the war effort themselves. As for what is likely to happen after this, that is anyone's guess. Technically speaking, the Japanese are not part of the Axis. At any given point, they could sue for peace. Perhaps in this case, it would be a white peace, where nothing is gained, nothing is lost. Chances are by the end of this conflict, the Japanese would be allowed to keep their territory within China, but of course, the regions around Manchukuo would be considered a demilitarized zone. Interestingly enough, the West would prefer to support Japan in this case. United Kingdom, France, etc., though temporary allies with the Soviet Union, the United States would not have wanted any of this and would have seen the Soviet Union as a major adversary. This would begin the Cold War period, and it would be important that Japan, though punished, is not punished too much. As such, it is possible that Japan in this timeline would be able to back out with a kind of white peace and save their honor, thus from that keeping a much more militarized government that simultaneously would serve as a bulwark against communism in Asia. Honestly, my friends, when we talk about this scenario, this is one that definitely was more fanciful than a lot of them because everything was dependent upon reactions, which depended upon reactions, which depended upon further reactions, and you never exactly know where things are going to turn. This is merely one possibility among hundreds that could potentially happen. And that is considering that if Japan had even done this going into 1940 or later. Another likely scenario is that Japan would have launched their preemptive strike back in 1937 or 1938 instead of going after China at all. That in turn means that if they had done so, considering how outnumbered they would have been, it would have been the same result as what you see now, except significantly worse. Japan would have lost everything, pretty much, until they reached all the way back to Korea to be able to defend the mountains. Past that point, it would have been a stalemate for potentially years before being forced to back out, with them losing much of their Chinese possessions. But that scenario would have been way too quick to make a video, so here it is that we are today. But if I had made that video, it probably would have been significantly quicker. Either way, my friends, thank you all very much for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, and please let me know in the comment section below what kind of scenarios you would like to see next. Remember, this is not about playing the game in order to try to win. This is utilizing the game as a medium in order to demonstrate something. Technically speaking, by the logic of this game, I would have easily been able to win that war. Very easily. With the Soviets distracted as they were, there wasn't really much that they could do. But that doesn't help tell the story now, does it? So my friends, thank you very much, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, guys.